Oh,
Go ahead.
Okay. So I came up with some questions to ask you. My first one is, I'm pretty sure this wasn't the first crime, so why do you think the FBI started on this crime?
on this particular crime?
Mhm.
Well, that's really pretty simple, because as you know, this was all, before it was homesteaded, it was all government land and whatnot. And this area, as homesteaders came into the western part of the state, the Homestead Act allowed them to have 160 acres. Well, of course, you couldn't make a living on 160 acres here. And so large cattle operators, after they found out the Texas herds came up, this was desert. Sandhills was considered desert. But then when they got rid of the buffalo crossing here and whatnot, and being grass country, became cattle country. And so some of these big outfits, for especially that were financed by British outfits, they started buying these Texas cattle to come up and throwing them into the sandhills. So they started outfits claiming this is their ranch, and they were great. They might have 10, 15,000 head of cattle of each one of them. Well, then when the homesteaders started coming in, that kind of bothered them a little bit. But not a lot, because it's through Hooker County and southern Cherry County and some of that area. They still couldn't make a living on it. And so not until 1904 the Kincaid Act came in, and they could start homesteading and get 640 acres. Well, then they brought a lot of people started coming in here, and so these big cattle outfits, basically two of them, Bartlett Richardson had all the panhandle, and Reverend George Ware, who was an Episcopal priest, but he was president of the UBI, United British Investors Company. They had all this land, which is Hooker and Thomas County, from the Dismal to the North Loop, and they run cattle, and all these homesteaders were coming in. So what they were doing, they would get like a Civil War widow, they could get a section of land without having to live on it 5 or 6 years. So they were bringing people in and having them homestead, and then buying them out and go on. So they were getting sections where there was water and whatnot. Well, this went all right, but then the homesteaders, then they were keeping them out. They had armed men, they wouldn't let them come in. They were doing this, and Theodore Roosevelt, thought that this was wrong, and so he was starting to investigate. Well, in this murder thing that you have, this Hamilton came in, and what he was doing was spotting places out in the middle of these big ranches that nobody owned the land, so he'd find a homesteader and bring him in and show them where to go. And so the local people that had been here a while didn't like that real well. So Roosevelt thought that this Hamilton was reporting them to the government. He'd go and find and report that this land was available for homesteading and whatnot. And all at once Hamilton disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to him. So that's when he sent an investigator in here to try to find out what happened to him. And of course what really had happened is Hamilton got in trouble with this saloon. Saloons were illegal in Mullen. We were private. They had an illegal saloon here. And Hamilton was going to report him to the authorities and get him closed down. And McBride was, that owned the saloon, kind of thought, the report was that he offered $1,000 to anybody that would kill him. Well, they didn't know they did, but anyway, if you read the story of the murder, that is what happened. They went in there and they did kill a guy and all that stuff. But the investigator that Roosevelt had in here, when he got to visiting with Clevenger and they found this was killed, they assumed that the UBI Cattle Company, because these guys were employees of them, had it done. And so that's, he sent it in there, and they just started in 1980, formed this, and they called it the Bureau of Investigation, and then later it got named Federal Bureau of Investigation. But that's how they got started in here, because they were trying to enforce the homestead law, and it had nothing really to do with the murder, except they thought this guy was killed by local ranchers to keep from getting homestead law. Does that answer anywhere near your question?
Okay, and so my second one is, did you know anyone in this crime or relatives of this crime?
Did I know any of them?
Or were you relatives of any of them?
Well, I wasn't really relatives to any of them, but then the family knows there's still a lot of descendants here, you know, that were of it. And this Hamilton's place, do you know where Mick Harding lives?
Yep.
And that was my grandfather. He came here in the 1880s when this was unorganized territory before the county or anything. So he was one of them that was a little unhappy when he was running cattle from here clear to Dismal too, and with no homesteaders. And this Hamilton's wife, he married the widow of a Civil War veteran, and they had a son, Earl, and Earl Sanford was given because he was a minor orphan son of a Civil War veteran. So he got a section of land, and that was just next to where Mick Harding lives. About a half mile west of him is where that Hamilton land was. So it was right close to my grandfather's place. And my grandfather was one of the suspects that maybe was having him killed because they did not like Hamilton. He was a very disliked gentleman. And that's the reason it was very strange. I'm working now on this George Ware that had the UBI cattle company here. They had a history of him. Came from South Dakota, he cleaned up in Deadwood a little bit, and then he came down here and was head of this cattle company. He was also an Episcopal priest, church, and so I don't know that that's just how they happened. They were trying to break up these big cattle companies, and Barbara Richards and Reverend Ware both were sent to federal prison because of these charges. So they really thought they had something to do with it. And when they had the trial and the jury didn't find him guilty, all the evidence showed that he was guilty, and they almost admitted, Clevenger admitted it. The jury was in session a very short time and said there was reasonable doubt and found him innocent.